So back in 2015, I was visiting a friend who lived in Burbank, California. You know those silly, creepy folklore tales where you go to a rural place where a tragedy had happened, then do some obscure thing, like flash your light 3 times, and then something super creepy happens? Yeah. Well, we were in our early 20s, and thought that doing something like that would be super cool and fun. My memory isn't the best, so I will probably get some of the details wrong. But the story goes that there was a children's psychiatric hospital on top of a massive hill, where a school bus had crashed while transporting many students, causing them to all die. The psychiatric hospital was now serving as a cemetery. You were to go to the cemetery, find the driveway leading to the house at the back of the grounds, and put your car in neutral. Then your car would be pushed up the hill, and you would have small fingerprints all over your bumper, from said ghost of the children's past. We were driving to the cemetery, and there was a tiny little village, literally only one stoplight, and a long winding road up to the top of the hill where the cemetery was. We finally get to the top and are driving around for a bit, trying to find a point to put the car into neutral. We're having a hard time finding it. The next thing you know, we turn the corner and I crap you not. There were about 30 people in white KKK hoods, with 20 feet long torches in a circle in the middle of the cemetery. Mind you, it's like 3 a.m. at this point. I'm completely freaking out. My friend who was driving seems mildly disturbed by it, just parks her car out of sight somewhere, looking at the KKK members. The next thing we know, there's a massive white pickup truck that comes speeding up behind us, flashing their lights and honking their horn. They're approaching us so quick, I think they're about to rear end us and hurt us. My friend puts her car into gear, and we try to outturn this truck. We were now being chased out of the cemetery down the winding hill. The truck is tailing us so hard, I truly didn't know how he didn't hit us. Once we pass the light to the exit of a small village at the bottom of the hill, the truck turns around and heads back up to the cemetery. Needless to say, I never did anything of the sort ever again. I've been friends with this guy named Ryan for 8 years now. We met in 4th grade. We just finished our junior year in high school. Him and I have both been fans of taking random walks. We've been doing it for a couple of years now. During the winter, spring, summer, and fall. It's safe to say we love taking walks. He lives a few blocks away from a cemetery. In order to get there, we go 2 straight blocks and take a right down a hill. There's this bridge we go through, then there's a cemetery. It's a large hill, so most of it isn't visible unless you're actually there. During 8th grade, we got a little bit distant and stopped hanging out as much as we used to. I became the popular kid, which is rather shocking, since I've always been an introvert, but I digress. The point I'm making is we didn't go on as many walks as we used to. In fact, barely any at all. We sort of rekindled our friendship in our early freshman year when COVID hit. We hung out a lot more and talked a lot more. We started walking to the cemetery more, and we noticed this yellow sports car parked. We didn't think much of it. Maybe someone was grieving. It was a cemetery after all. We continued to take walks there, and every time we would go, the yellow car was parked in the same spot. The lights were turned off. It just sat there, for hours at a time. Again, we didn't really think much of it. After becoming a little bit more distant in my sophomore year, we began hanging out more during the beginning of our junior year. We went to the cemetery, like usual, and there was the same yellow car. It was just there, doing nothing. We both knew it wasn't a worker, since the car was parked in the middle of the path you drive through, not in the parking lot near the buildings. But we still carried on. Fast forward to May, we were just about to finish our junior year. We went to the cemetery at about 9 p.m., since I got a job at a pizza place back in January. I always worked from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. on every weekday besides Thursday. We walked like usual, talking about true crime and about movies that were coming out soon, when all of a sudden we noticed the car wasn't there anymore. The cemetery has lots of hills and stretches out. Maybe a few thousand graves with still a lot of room. You have to walk up a hill to get to the main area, and most of the graveyard is still not visible because of the hills. We continued walking to where the car usually parks, since we've never ever been over there. We continued talking about our issues, and we noticed a car driving on the path. We didn't think too much of it, but when it came closer, we saw it was yellow. Same type of headlights, same license plate. It was dark out at that point, so we relied on our flashlights from our phone. We got a little bit freaked out, but carried on. We walked a little bit until the yellow car stopped at its usual place. We stopped for a second, roughly 30 feet away from the car, with our flashlights still on. We heard the door open and footsteps approaching us. We gasped and shut our phones off. We bolted away. We were faster than any person we knew, and they were running after us. I asked Ryan in a whisper if he brought pepper spray with us, and of course, the one time this happens, he didn't bring it. We hid behind big gravestones for a minute, waiting to see if he would run past, but he didn't come. He must have given up. We waited another minute and bolted out of the cemetery, completely out of breath. We joked about it a little bit, since before we went to the graveyard we said, "Imagine if something terrifying happened to us. Speak of the devil." I still wonder what would have happened if they caught up to us. I wonder what they would have done. I'm glad that Ryan and I took extreme caution when we saw that car. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be telling you this now. So my cousin and I are visiting our dearly departed with the rest of our family. The cemetery was more crowded than usual because it was November 1st, All Souls Day. After giving our prayers, the rest of the family was just chilling and talking. Bored, my cousin and I decided to wander around the cemetery and check out gravestones. We came to a mildly isolated section of the cemetery. I was absorbed in checking out some of the gravestones when suddenly I heard footsteps walking towards me. Worried that I might have been loitering on someone's past relative, I quickly looked ahead towards the footsteps and noticed an old man in rags right in front of me. He was slightly limping and had some kind of smirk on him. "What's your name?" he asked. I didn't like the tone of his voice. Something was very off about him. I was staring at him for a few seconds until my cousin's voice cut me off my trance. "Run!" I heard her say. When I looked back, she was already about 10 meters ahead of me, sprinting towards a more populated side of the cemetery, quite a distance away from where we were. Snapping out of it, I ran after my cousin. I wasn't a very fast runner, and I was really clumsy too. I was so close to tripping over a gravestone until finally, my cousin and I reached a spot where there was lots of people. Panting and not really registering what had happened, I asked, "What the hell was that about?" My cousin looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "You didn't see it?" "See what?" I figured it was just an old man in rags who was probably going to ask me for some money or something. My cousin told me that old man actually had a broken bottle behind him. When we were already running for it, she looked back and saw the old man was not limping anymore, and he was actually running after me. I can't imagine what would have happened if he caught me. I'm just so thankful that he never did, because it seriously scared the absolute hell out of me. This happened about 13 years ago when I was 10. It was in a small town in New Jersey where nothing bad ever happened, or so I thought. I didn't have many friends growing up, so I would take my Game Boy Advance and sit under the willow tree in the cemetery next to our house, playing my heart's content until it was pitch dark outside. This cemetery was quite big, and it began outside our house and ended a few streets down, where the highway was. Even though it was a cemetery, it didn't have that many graves, so it was more like a park than anything. You could see most of the cemetery from our backyard, and my mom would sit at the patio just to keep an eye on me. The cemetery had a funeral home on site, and caretakers lived there too. I would often see the caretakers walking around, and even became acquainted with them. As I got older, I was 10 at that time, my mom started to trust me a little bit. I was given my first Nokia, which I was to have on me at all times, and would receive a call from my mom every 15 minutes. She warned me that if I ever didn't pick up, she was calling the police. With my newfound freedom, I decided one day to venture into the cemetery. It was beginning to get dark, and the trees were much denser in this part. With old graves, it looked as though the ground had swallowed them up. I distinctly remember a chill running down the back of my spine as I heard a tree branch break behind me. I quickly turned around and came face to face with a stranger. My first thought was he was one of the caretakers, but I then realized I did not recognize him. He wore a gray suit and had long hair, and seemed friendly as he smiled. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you there," he said, taking a step back. I let out a sigh of relief, stupidly, as I figured he was here for a funeral. I didn't say anything and nervously smiled, feeling awkward in the situation. I prayed he would leave me alone so I could continue exploring, but instead, he gazed around the area, noticed his hands were trembling, and he had a slight tick in his eye. "You live around here?" he asked, and this time, he took a step forward. Even though he was smiling, the gaze in his eyes made me feel so uncomfortable. I felt pure fear sink in. I took a step back and didn't dare speak a word. I was thinking of a way to escape, but I wasn't a fast runner. My phone was in front of my jean pocket, and I was scared if I took it out, it might anger him. Just as he took another step forward, my phone started to ring. "That's my mom," I announced, as I quickly answered my phone call. The last thing I remember was seeing the annoyance on his face as I walked away and out of sight, all the while talking to my mom on the phone about some random stuff. I remember stumbling over a shovel on my way to the cemetery, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. I ran home and gave my mom a big hug, but didn't tell her what had happened. I didn't want her to worry about me, and frankly, I just wanted to forget about it, forget that it ever had happened. The next day, my mom discovered the garage door was damaged. Someone had tried to break the lock and managed to lift the door by a few inches. I remember bursting into tears and having a full-blown panic attack as I explained to my mom what had happened in the cemetery. That man obviously tried to break into her house. I could only imagine what would have happened if he succeeded. My mom called the cops and everything, but in the end, they weren't able to ever find him.